I said I'll give them 2 minutes. If they're not here in 2 minutes, we're starting without them. Welcome to everybody that's just joined. Thank you all for coming. Oops. Okay. Here we go. So I'm going to leave my comments, my meeting chat open, so that if you guys have any questions anytime during the discussion, please don't hesitate to drop your guys' questions, so that once we're able to have the time to read the questions, or if we need to address something quickly, Dr. Kodero and I are able to see that and answer your questions. Officially welcome to the discussion on understanding and examining the U.S. racial wealth gap. This is a very wonderful conversation that we're having in celebration of Black History Month. We are here with our very, very own guys. You know, somebody from home. This is Dr. Ubba Kodero. I will be reading his bio so that you guys can get just a glimpse of the great things that our professor has achieved. Like I mentioned, his name is Dr. Ubba Kodero. He's currently a visiting assistant professor at the College of Idaho's Political Economy Department. He has a PhD from Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. He studied international relations, focusing on the international political economy. His dissertation titled Rethinking the Functions of Regional Economic Communities, why the African small states join and remain in sub-regional entities, examined why small economy states in Africa embrace regional cooperation even as they lose economically. The dissertation revealed the non-economic roles of regionalism, expanding the meaning of rationalism to include non-stated benefits such as identity, solidarity, regime boosting, and sovereignty boosting aspects for ruling regimes. In addition to the PhD, Dr. Kodero holds an MA in African Studies from FIU, an MA in International Studies from the University of Wyoming, and a BA in Political Science from Principal College. His works have appeared on International Relations and African Studies Quarterly. He also has 2 book chapters in the Handbook of African Political Economy by Palgrave Macmillan. Outside academia, Dr. Cordero has worked for City Mortgage, Barclays Bank, Tenaker Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization, and as a grassroots organizer for our 54th president, Barack Obama, and Senator Claire McCaskill. I'm so sorry for pronouncing that so wrong. In 2008 and in 2012, runs in Missouri. Dr. Ubba is also married to his wonderful wife, Alice Nikuzwe, who is from Rwanda, and together they have 2 girls and a boy. Welcome again. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I will also just allow Dr. Kodero to, toot his own horn a little bit before we get into the discussion. Dr. Kodero.
Thank you so much, Zee, for such a wonderful introduction. It's amazing to be here today and to talk to you guys. I'm really impressed about the attendance. It's very supportive. I see a lot of people here, so it makes me a little nervous. But I'm happy to be here and to talk to you guys all. So my background, I am from Kenya. I grew up in a small town in Western Kenya, at the border with Tanzania, and so I never thought any day that I'll be in the United States to study or do anything. It was just not part of my dream or plans, but it did happen. I got a scholarship to come to a small college, Principia College in Southern Illinois, and from that college, I got my first degree, but midway through the degree, I just got burned out. there was a lot of cultural adjustment issues that I was facing. At the time, it was more what do you call right now in correct mental illness issues. So I took a break and went back to Kenya for a year, and I found a job at Barclays Bank, which was very good and enlightening for me, and allowed me to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. And so I came back and I re-enrolled and graduated. I was lucky to regain my scholarship, and after that, in the process of getting my degree, I was really excited about the Obama's campaign in 2008. So I enlisted as a grassroots organizer, and it was an exciting time. And it helped that Obama was half Kenyan, so I was really motivated by his journey and all that. And I after that I got politically engaged, made some networks, and after graduation, I worked the campaign for Claire McCaskill and Barack Obama in Missouri. One was successful; the senatorial race was successful. The presidential race was not successful in Missouri, but it was victorious nationwide. So it was exciting to be part of that. And then later on, I worked for City Mortgage in O'Fallon. I was still working for in the mortgage industry at the time, which was a hard time because a lot of people were losing houses, and I was really involved with that as a much more lower level kind of structure. But what I noticed then was a kind of like a class dynamic. It gave me a lens into an American society that I never experienced before. Because my school was a liberal arts school. Most of the students there were upper middle class students, and it was just a different reality. Seeing these banking documents on loans, mostly people of color who were losing their houses, and Missouri was hit so bad. So it wasn't a happy time for me, but it kind of gave me a lens on looking at American society that I never seen before, and made me a little more knowledgeable, and also worry about certain things that weren't clear at institutional level. And so I asked myself why this income reduction, like this transfer of wealth or this empowerment was happening mostly for lower class and minorities as opposed to a majority of society, and St. Louis was particularly hit. So that's one of the things that intrigued me to study race relations and income distribution in the United States as well as internationally. Z, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm so sorry about that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Wonderful. I'm so sorry. I'm so out of breath. My laptop almost died. So
Yeah.
I was running to find my charger. I'm so sorry about that. So we're going to go straight into our first question so that I can kind of just lead us into the discussion. Please, like I said, if you missed it, don't hesitate to ask any questions. The meeting chat is open, and I'll be reading them as much as I can so that we can engage in conversation with Dr. Kodero. So our first question for Dr. Kodero is, could you please share with us one of some of your stories on both your background and personality, and personally, like professionally, like some of your stories that like pushed you to like kind of fully talk or engage or research about the US racial wealth gap?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about my background earlier. I don't know if you noticed that, but so later on at graduate school level, I studied international relations and most international studies in two different places. My first master's was at University of Wyoming. It is predominantly white dominated state. No, it was interesting in its own dynamics as well. But yeah, it was enriching to understand America from that perspective. and narratives about the country and what it means for many people. And so when I moved down to Florida in Miami, it is a much more multicultural, racially diverse, with people from different countries, and predominantly Cuban-dominated city. And it was a totally different dynamic as well. But what it did give me was an opportunity to look at how income inequality plays out. Now, ideas of race are kind of complicated and not more monolithic. So if you think about what it means to be Black, how you think about it in Wyoming is totally different from how it plays out in South Florida. And for me, I was confronted for the first time to ask myself, what does it mean to be Black?
Right.
What does it mean to be Black in Africa? What does it mean to be Black in America? And what does it mean in terms of how wealth is spread out and sort of like how people experience it in terms of material things that matter in life, rather than just ideological connections and feelings of exclusion and inclusions.
Right.
So yeah, so it's driven with the pursuit of knowing about my identity and how my identity is processing other things like such as income and power.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously on the topic of being African in America and being African American, I don't know if you had the chance to kind of conversate or engage in conversation with somebody who's actually African American, so an American Black born person, comparing it to your struggles with, let's say, obviously you were a student in multiple colleges. How was, like, obviously fees differed because then you come in as an international student, whereas they're coming in as a student from, like, in their home. How did you notice the difference in, like, pay, or like in the ways you had to pay your taxes or anything with getting jobs and all of that as an African? And I don't know if you had the chance to speak to an American, like an African American, about that difference, and if you've seen the differences between you and an African American.
Yeah, so you're asking me about my experience as a student, or in general about this experience
Right.
of Blackness and how it differs from each region to region and state to state or country to country, right?
Country to country more so.
Okay. Now, at the official level, you don't notice much difference. It's like being Black is just being Black. It's not being in most spaces. It's not being European of European background, but it also means something more than that. It's also being post-colonial, having suffered the consequence of societies that were dominated by other actors who might have been foreign. So it's a question of identity and belonging. And on which space do you own and which one you don't own. So when you come to America as an international student, in a Western space, African Americans are also Americans. So they are Westerners in that sense, okay? So their views of life are comparable to what an average American view of life will be, worldview in general. But as an African, there's a slight difference. Even that, within that, there's also little nuances based on backgrounds of class. So wealthy African students are different from working class African students, as well as rural living African student. And those nuances play out in relationship that people make. All right, but in a Western space, they being an African, sort of being is sometimes not nuanced enough. There's a tendency to generalize that as on Africa as a collective identity, and also to racialize it. So it's like create different distinction of what it means to be an African. So it's like the difference of North African versus a person from Horn of Africa, Ethiopian or Somali, different from is the Bantu-speaking African countries.
Right.
Yeah, and those kind of nuances exist in society, and how you how you're viewed and how you occupy a space. But it's not like just the ideational issues too. They also have real-time meanings and privilege that might go unspoken about. All right. So those consequences play out in your socialization, and our society thinks about what you could be. But fundamentally, for many Africans, is super ignorant about a shared experience of Blackness, one of being subjugated. So here in the Western space, it's more about a racialized history, or history of losing freedom, and or lack of rootedness, lack of a consequence of dislocation, right? But
Right.
while in an African sense, it's more of like colonial domination. Both of these are subjugations. So the forces of violence and have impact on identity, but they are processed differently in
Okay.
different spaces. I don't know if that makes sense. So
No, that
this,
makes sense.
yeah. So
Um,
as then there's the other idea of taxes, right? So that's more like a state policy issue. So some countries have like relations with other countries that give them special taxes. So like an Indonesian or Malaysian, like have different taxes. That's totally a different conversation
mhm.
to what we're talking about here,
Right.
with
Okay.
specific to race. Yeah.
Okay. Um, I mean, for some people who don't understand what the U.S. racial wealth gap is all about, do you mind giving us a kind of brief explanation so that as we're going further with this conversation, people understand or get a brief idea of what the U.S. racial gap might mean? Or could you explain the issue to us, if you don't mind?
Okay, so what we're talking about is here to understand the wealth gap, and I have to be clear on my positionality on this issue. So I'm talking about it as an outsider. So obviously, there's a lot of nuances that now some insider perspectives might differ with what my analyses are. And secondly, it is purely based on my experience and observation and study, and a totally different outcome is also acceptable, and opinion respected. So the thing is, it's a real issue in the United States, and is often understated. On average, Americans are less aware of how much wealth disparity exists when it comes to race. So the general perception is tend to be more optimistic than the reality, and the perception is that there's been a lot of progress, and society is going towards equality, and individuals, if they work harder, they can do better and improve themselves. And to a certain extent, that is true. And evidence, scholarship suggests that there is a general growth towards uh, upliftment of people who have been historically marginalized.
Right.
But even with that, there still exists some inherent structural issues that have never been fixed, that are still present in the way society is organized. So here we're talking about things like uh, Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis did a study, and they found that Americans are optimistic about how much progress has been made. But in real sense, the wealth gap between white American families and Black American family is almost, the white American family is like 11 times more median wealth than the average Black American family. So it's huge in this generation. And as we move to the next generation, there's going to be a massive transfer of wealth based on home ownership and savings that will greatly even exacerbate this existing disparity. And it's
Right.
also regional. So in some states, you find more less inequality than others. So states with less Black populations, like Wyoming or Idaho, have slightly less disparity. And states that are predominantly Black have a greater disparity in income.
Mm.
And those states also tend to be the state that experience effects of Jim Crow and slavery in the South.
Right.
Yeah.
So, are you, well, with that being said, because my next question was going to be, knowing that this is a very complex matter, and knowing what to like what extent it's causing an effect in the country. Like, is there a certain, like, is there a root cause? But I'm seeing that you've mentioned Jim Crow and slavery. So would we say that that was the root cause to all of these disparities amongst the different states or amongst different races in the US?
I wouldn't say that it's like a root cause for anything. It's difficult to pinpoint anything and say exactly this is what caused it. All right, but what we can study the history of institutions in the U.S. and also the history of different people groups and see how those kind of factors have played out in income distribution. So I don't know about root cause. I do know of the historical evolution of things and processes and people's history. So, for example, the regions I told you earlier, like in the American South, the deep American South, are also places that had slavery going on, and after that had Jim Crow. But so then there's like a great disparity of wealth that is generational, as well as encouraged by policies that specific states took over time. At the same time, you notice that there's disparities in major cities in terms of housing and home ownership, access to schooling, and socially enabling environments for economic achievements that are outside the South, okay, affecting minorities more than majority populations in the country.
Right.
Yeah.
And so with this racial wealth gap in the US, what is its impact on generational wealth as a whole? Like, where would we be in terms of, how people like to continue, like, start something for like their families? How does that differ from, like, what is the biggest impact that the US racial wealth gap has on generational wealth per race, if that makes sense?
It does have an impact on how much accessibility to economic empowerment the next generations will have. And it's not a question, it's not like punitive towards those who have those advantages. It's not their fault, all right? It's an institutional issue. And I think there's a little more of a angst when talking about things like this and emotiveness that it might be accurate and correct, but it doesn't mean that we these scholarships pointing towards blame and all this. It's just what it is. It is the history of the country, and it has to be handled, and it has consequences for the future, because it is gonna entrench inequality, and highly unequal societies are unstable.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's not really advantageous to the beneficiaries as well, because it could be super disruptive. It's the history of revolutions notice that when there's so much income inequality, society tends to be super disruptive.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So from a historical standpoint,
Yeah.
how have financial or economic crises impact impacted people of color?
Yeah, so that's I don't know if you're asking me if one financial crisis or many financial crises.
Just, yeah, many financial crises from like the past, but even current. How have
Oh,
that
okay, yeah. Some of the earlier financial crises that are major, like the Great Recession in the U.S., happened in the 1920s, and that was an era that is different from now, right? In so many ways, it was different because it was the first time there was an attempt to make a global economy in a more meaningful way. And then it crashed, all right, because of many other factors, including speculation and uh, the banks weren't doing what they were supposed to do then. Um, But the other factor was that for people of color back then, they weren't fully integrated in economic enterprises in America. It's not like they weren't doing the economic activities, just that marginally included in economics. So in the South, you still have Jim Crow. In the Midwest and many other northern cities, you had segregation. So when the Great Depression hit, it really did hit those who are like kind of informal economies and less integrated in the mainstream American economic advancement. It did hit poor white folks and farmers in the West and in the Southwest harder too. But those who also tended to be poor, people of less means.
Right.
So then you come to it's like we're skipping a broad, painting history with a broad brush. Then you come to the most recent financial crisis, which is 2007, and it was kind of like before that it was like a general optimistic view about how the country was going, and home ownership rates and middle class ascendancy among people of color, both Hispanic and blacks, was rising. So it's like a moment of hope. And then the financial crisis hit, and this is this. So the effect of this kind of what leads me to this kind of scholarship is because I saw it working at City Mortgage, how much it affected people of color, that they lost homes because of subprime lending and a super optimistic view about the corrective ways of the market and limited regulation. So rather than have a general progression towards growth, it kind of hit a dent and created some of the crisis. Not only did it hurt many people of color who were just trying to start out home ownership and build enterprise, it also did hurt also poor people, white people in general. So it kind of like created a class society where those who were less affected owned capital emerged as winners, and those who are with limited capital and historically excluded as losers, and it just created a super toxic environment that we see playing out in the politics right now in the US.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
so before I move on to the question, to the next question, Sinikwe Masugu says, I think it's interesting how in states with a bigger population of people of color, the wealth disparity is greater. Is this cause of redlining and depriving Black communities of resources?
So you're asking me if that's the case? Yes, there's a lot of scholarships that have been done connecting home ownership and access to home ownership as an opportunity for creating wealth because of equity and all the advantages that, and also the simple fact that sometimes owning a home is cheaper than renting one. So over time, you pass these advantages to the next generation, and it really excludes a great chunk of people who cannot get in. And redlining is one of those. It was right, blatantly speaking, was a racist idea of making sure that banks weren't loaning to Black people in specific zones and kind of restricting them to other areas that were less profitable and with less likelihood of gaining equity in their housing. So it's kind of condemned a group of people to a specific area, what other scholars have called ghettoization. So then ghetto areas become less financially viable. Until then, you get to another era of speculative urban investment in housing, where all those ghetto areas become potentially profitable, lucrative for investment. So then you have a second problem called gentrification, which is as well dispossessing as well as helpful in ways, but dispossessive because it kind of breaks up communities and could create a lot of homelessness and housing crisis, as we see in California now or New York.
So in terms of the financial and economic impact on people of color, what role has affirmation action played in all of this?
Affirmative actions. Okay, so you're fine. So there's like the idea that income inequality is a problem in the United States. It's not a new issue. It's been studied and the policy has been made historically to correct it. Because remember, the United States emerged out of the Second World War a leading power, and you don't want to be a leading power with a big chunk of your population in poverty. So it's like earlier projects to alleviate poverty and to remove people from being condemned to hopelessness and to not pursue American dreams of self-advancement in many forms. So the federal government as well as the states have been encouraging efforts towards inclusive economic agendas for a long time. Just the modalities have been partially successful and partially unsuccessful. So like, it's in the 30s, you have FDR, massive state interjection in the economy to create jobs and to create reduce unemployment. And then you go to LBJ's war on poverty in the 60s, mostly in rural areas and in the South. That was partially successful as well. Increased road access, electricity, access to school and healthcare and all that. And then you go to the 70s and there's a different view of poverty, more focused on the market as a fixer to the problem. So the debate here is on how the market could provide opportunities, especially in this during the Reagan time, and the market here would enable people to be competitive and to change their ways. So perhaps it was kind of like an simulationist agenda. Like, well, the reason why a lot of these people are not in poverty is because they're not working hard. They do not want to change their means, and the way to do it is to let the market solve this problem, encourage competition, create, it's called trickle-down economics, create a lot of wealth, and over time those wealth will create opportunities that are favorable. And those who are competitive and desiring to be uplifted will be uplifted. And those who want to stay in poverty will remain in poverty. And that did not. So then you asked me about affirmative action, right? Affirmative action projects started out in 1960s by JFK, John F. Kennedy, and to include previously excluded minorities in positions where they could be outcompeted because of structural constraints. So it could be women, mostly women, people of color, people who were disabled, people from rural areas now were gaining access to jobs that they were potentially uncompeted, could be considered qualified for. Would have less access to, even if they would be qualified. And for the most part, affirmative action projects have really worked. They've increased a lot of opportunities for many people to step into these roles that they will be out of because of social network issues, and increase business opportunities for minority business owners. But it's a super political issue. So some people think that it is giving people an undue advantage. Other people think it's not fair, and for those who are left out. It's super political. But the scholarship suggests that it has greatly increased the number of people who have joined the middle class in many countries that have adopted it, including South Africa and India for the lower caste people. Yeah.
So that was firstly, that was a bunch of information, very helpful information in understanding affirmative action. So discussions around closing the wealth gap inevitably bring up reparations. Could you explain what the arguments are for and against this approach?
Yeah, if affirmative action was contentious and political, reparation is just going to cause a world war. I mean, figuratively speaking, right? But yeah, it is. It's even more contested and really hard to bring in. Although there's a lot of progressive politicians in the U.S. now agitating for that as a measure of justice and morality and fairness. But here's the background of affirmative action. Of a reparation payment. It's like they are not new things. It's not. A lot of people think it's a new thing that's really radical and super leftist, but it isn't new. It's not new because it's been done before. So in 1833, the British Empire ended slavery in the empire. It had ended slavery in the islands maybe like 15 years before that. So the empire, that's the area that it controlled, and mostly included the Atlantic. So they were sinking ships of slave traders and all that, and trying to prevent. Of course, they were not altruistic. They had other means. They had industrialized. And Adam Smith, they had industrialized. Later on, Adam Smith was writing Wealth of Nations. So it's a different economic logic at the time. But when they did ban slavery, they paid those who had taken loans to buy slaves. They sort of pay reparations to them, but they didn't do this to enslaved people who were mostly relocated to Sierra Leone and other outposts of the British Empire. So that was the first paid reparation payment. Reparation is just payment for injury or for some cause that has been misjustice. So you pay to correct that injustice. So 1833 British pays enslavers or slave traders this money, and then in the U.S. After the Civil War, Lincoln acknowledged the problem and set up a payment plan for like 40 acres and a mule for enslaved Black people in the South, so they could restart their life in such a contested space, ideologically, and a lot of emotions running. And as you know, Lincoln is killed shortly after that, and his successor do not want to continue. He's a Southerner. He returns these confiscated Southern lands to the former enslavers, and that reparation debate just it canceled. But for property owners in Washington, D.C. area mostly benefited from owning slaves and buying these properties were paid back by the federal government. So there's a history in the U.S. of this happening. There's just no history of it happening to Black people. You could say the same about other minorities groups who have been hurt historically, like Asian Americans, especially Japanese, got paid by the federal government for being kept in internment camps in the 1940s because they were considered enemies of the state during the World War II era and suffered horrible, horrible conditions of being considered an American and all that, and kept in detention camp. And Jewish people in Germany who were survivors of the genocide were also paid back, as well as Native Americans of God and Islam. So the only group in the United States that has not been paid reparations are the African American groups. So that's the debate, that's the background. So the argument for it is one of justice and fairness, as well as of income inequality. The argument against it is one of well, it's like how far back can we go? And what about this incredible make that I told you about South Florida in it? Like, what about the Black Cubans? What about the Black Jamaicans, Haitians, all these people here? How are we gonna divide whose background America is responsible, who's not? So it's like super contested, and then who's going to pay for it? So those are the arguments for and against.
Which makes very, very much sense, because who gets what share, one, I think, is another issue. And like you said, who pays it? Because then the conversations or the arguments of, but we were not there during that time, come up, you know? But also, in your opinion, what are some of the measures that could close the wealth gap and any other gaps that persist, in your opinion?
Yeah, the big divide in my scholarship in political economy, I say it almost constantly, when there's too much income inequality, there's a revolution. And it doesn't always end well. The Russians removing the Tsar because of excessive income inequalities, like civil war in Britain because of income inequality. You can always connect civil wars all over the world and acts of genocide or ethnic cleansing to economic disparity in a society. And some of the most unequal societies, even in the Western space, are also the most violent. Mexico, Brazil, Chicago in the US. So there's almost like a direct correlation between income inequality and episodes of violence. So there is an argument to correct the issue. How to correct, and most people do know that, how to correct is the problem. And part of the argument that I'm making is that perhaps we should consider reparation pyramids selectively for communities, but also pursue a much more integrative economic policies and political policies that are more inclusive rather than exclusive, that attempt to capture more people.
Right.
So yeah.
So, like, do you think that there are any communities that have implemented successful initiatives to make progress in the right direction?
Yeah, there's a lot of states that are trying to do that. There's a bunch of cities, I think 12 cities. I'm mentioning them in the Wallet Hub. But I remember right off the top of my head is Chicago, Evanston, Chicago, that are paying Black families who were affected by housing discrimination going back to like 100 years back, and paying them, I think, $40,000 over the next 10 years as down payment for housing, so they can have access to it. So it's like you can have selected interjection in the economy to correct these wrongs that have been done, make it right. But in addition to that, it's like a little more. I think there's a less awareness of how much income inequality is damaging to the stability of a society in general. I think people do not realize how much that is. And a lot of focus is on correcting behaviors and economic structures and cultures, and I've been studying this for a while. And what I do know is that institutions do create cultures of people, and if historically a group of people have been excluded from economic activity or political organization, people tend to project them the way they want to project them. Doesn't mean those two people are inherently that. It's just a function of institutional culture that has evolved in those societies. So when you talk about racism, you're just not talking about calling people the N-word. It's also it could also mean talking less about their culture is condemned to a specific outcome of de-development, underdevelopment, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So okay, sorry, I thought you were responding to somebody else. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, sorry. So now I'm going to, guys, we've got 10 more minutes for question and answers between the audience. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have. Also, just not to disregard, Professor Cheesewright kind of put in a link for reparations, an article on reparations. It's a good read, so I would suggest that everybody clicks on the link to see it. and read the article. Also, I will put in a link for Dr. Kodero's article on states with the most and the least racial progress on Wallet Hub. I will put that link down below. But please, like I said, now we are open to any questions that you might have for Dr. Kodero, or even kind of comments that you have for Dr. Kodero. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise a hand so that I can see you if you have something to say, so that I can put you on stand while I'll be copying the link for the article. Okay. So it's looking like this was a pretty straightforward discussion. And oh, okay, there we go. So sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so I have a general question from Professor Kodero. The African American problem and question in recent years seems to be integrated within the general sort of progressive discourse in United States about inequality, and it seems to be stripped away from its connection to the larger African problem with post-colonialism and with oppression globally, which was something Pan-Africanists, for example, advocated for us, viewing the African struggle as a global phenomena rather than just an isolated sort of national-based problem. You, as an African scholar, where do you stand in that? Yeah.
Dila, thank you for we'll talk on this for a whole another lecture altogether. But yeah, sort of like Ali, I was talking to you about different misunderstanding. I was telling Z about what it means, why Blackness is connected, although disconnected in many levels. The point of connection here is this shared experience of the otherness and subjugation. All right. So if you're an African, you experience colonialism, okay? It kind of totally distorts how you think about the world, right? In so many ways, right? And then you come to the US and you meet a lot of these African Americans who also experience another form of subjugation in the form of slavery, as well as people from Brazil or Jamaica and all, in addition to colonialism for those in Latin America. So there are like multiple layers of trauma here. And this society is constantly trying to find where they belong. So in the US, it's more pronounced because it is super polemic. And the US occupies an important place in global discourse in many things, right? So what is asking me is about the structure of the international political economy, the structure of where is Africa's place in terms of like production of like coltan in the Congo, or cobalt, or tea in Kenya, or the Algerian occupation of Algeria by France, and all this in relation to income equality in the US. I don't think those two things are connected directly. There is history to that. There's history. We can explain the history of subjugation and slavery and all that, and especially European slavery. But slavery had many variations before. Arab slavery, Africans enslaving themselves. So many layers to it. But if you talk about this modern phase of connection, structural connection, the only connection you make it with Africa is that transfer, the crossing of the Atlantic to the New World, from which new identity is created. And this new identity then poses a problem in the American space. So how do we deal with this group of people? So economic institutions have never captured their sense of exclusion for generations. So it is a problem in American discourse, and constantly trying to solve it. And we see it in replaying itself out in many facets of society, including the George Floyd incident. So there is a lack of recognition of that. It's connected to Africa, but it's a totally different strain of it. Yeah.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions from anybody else? Just before we can close, we are 10 minutes early, but I know being early never hurt anybody. And also that means we had a great discussion. Okay. Questions? There we go. Go ahead, Priska.
Yes, my question is regarding, I guess, wealth in regards to Black people in the U.S. specifically, and how it's preserved and how it's usually conceived through sort of, at least from what I've observed, material kind of wealth. So like the life of like having a lot of ice, like having jewelry, or so wealth that is more like the idea of like looking nice and having fancy cars and stuff, and never wealth that's like invested through property and stuff like that. And like, what do you think that is the effect of? Where does that development sort of come from? And that can't be true for all African Americans, but at least wealth sort of only appearing through fancy things and luxurious things, and never really represented through other mediums or other ways.
I think that's a super generalized assumption, though. I just call it out as it is. But in general, those are like super cultural connotation. In other countries, showing wealth and buying a new car and a bigger house is kind of looked down upon. If you go to Scandinavia and most European societies in the North, that's the case. But in America, this cultural acceptance for success is celebrated. It's not looked down upon, right? So when you see people buying jewelry, I'm just going to move out because it's losing light. That is often seen as a sign. We celebrate that. We celebrate people buying new cars, new clothes. It's not seen as damaging. So what they're trying to do is perform success, which you see in hip hop videos and all that kind of thing. Perform success without sometimes real success. It's a performative act. It doesn't speak to inequality. That's another issue of inequality is a totally different issue from how people perform by dressing nice, or driving a car they can afford. It speaks to a lot more about society that we live in that values people who operate like, who look like that, rather than the substance of what material of what success really is. This is financial literacy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Priska, I hope that answered your question. Aman, I hope I said your name correctly, is asking, how do hiring practices play a role in the racial wealth gap, and how can we begin to change that?
Yeah, so yeah, it does create a lot of less opportunities for people who are not being seen, because people we all have biases. I do have my own biases. There's things that I socially connect to me that I pick out, all right? And the idea that we are immune from these biases is a fallacy, right? And I think many sociologists have reckoned with this fact. So then you create opportunity. If you have like a diverse hiring group, that means you're gonna pick up on some clues that you might be missing if you just like a bunch of male guys, of a certain social class. So the more diverse a hiring committee is, the more likely that you're gonna tap into more people that you will necessarily not have to. But the other thing is just thinking about, it's just like a personal responsibility in what you're gonna be looking at. Like a student called out me in class last semester and say, well, we've been reading a lot of political economy, and we're reading a lot from Ivy educated white males. All right, and it seems to us, you're suggesting to us that they're the only ones who know what to talk about. And I was super grateful to that student because he gave me a moment of reflection to think about other voices that were required in the discourse about development, which is about economic growth and social advancement. So yeah, we have to, it's more self-reflection and awareness of where we are, mostly when it comes to hiring.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Aman, I hope that answered your question to the fullest. Okay, there we go. Adding on to Aman, how can political structures, this is Priya, I'm so sorry for not saying your name before this. Priya's saying, adding on to Aman, how can political structures ensure that organizations or corporations are making changes to their systems that are deep and not on a surface level? Do you think this is important to political structures in predominantly white countries?
It's a problem in every society, including my country called Kenya, where it's like performative acts are done in the moment something comes to the scene. And corporation, you have to hold corporations' foot to the fire to really mean what they're saying. I mean, I think 2000, at the height of George Floyd's movement, a lot of things came up, discussions and all that. But after that, it just kind of died down, right? The issues addressed in George Floyd's death that it revealed are not absent anymore, but it's less in the focus. Now we are concerned about other things. Same can be said about Me Too movement as well and women rights. So the idea is that, I don't know if I have answer to this, but a solution has to be where people have to own this process, right? And people are not CEOs and what, because they're not shells. People inhabit those spaces. So this is about meaningfulness and values of individuals, right? It's not about, corporations want to make money. That's what they're gonna do forever. That's what they're created. But individuals who occupy those spaces have to own progressive ideas about income equality, about wealth transfer, about a type of society they want to live on for the future. That is what is going to make change. It has to be a reckoning. Yeah?
With that being said, again, thank you so much for your question, Priya, and I hope Dr. Kodero answered to the fullest. We have time, I think, for one more question, or done. Should we leave it here?
I'll ask one more question, Z.
Sure.
Yeah, Dr. Kodero, just to wrap up, I wanna talk to the idea of higher education and the role that's played within this whole conversation. This idea of economic advancement for people of color, you've talked about that, and higher education is seen as a path right towards that. However, we see massive student loan debt and sluggish income markets that have shown that research is showing that Black and other people of color have not been necessarily able to shrink any racial wealth gaps. Can you talk to that a little bit and maybe why that's happening, what role higher education should play in all that?
I think higher education is really a great opportunity for advancement for people who are historically marginalized. I can't underscore how much that important it is for me. And I'm privileged enough to come from a background where my father went to college and my grandfather graduated high school. But for most people in my background, in the small town I grew up in, 12th grade is all they get. And that really limits how much you can do. So access to higher education, the opportunities that students have here at the College of Idaho are really transformational because it enables them to learn skills, which I talk about in the article, which they can transfer them to their kids. It's a crucial moment, a crucial resource of wealth transfer not just material wealth, but ideas. Most of it is just ideas, all right? So some families benefit from ideas. So higher education is really important. So I think there is a general consensus in increasing access to higher education. The problem is often, as Aiden, I think you know this, is the pipeline. How are you going to get kids, especially Hispanic kids from bad neighborhood, to think about college? How are you going to get Black kids from Southside Chicago or from Deep South in the rural areas where sometimes there's no electricity to consider college as an option?
Mm.
Yeah, this is kind of the dynamics we are working, but there's a general progress. If you want to know the number of women, especially Black women, getting PhDs is skyrocketing. It's the highest ever, right? And occupying spaces of power ever than before. So there's trajectory. There seems to be a problem with the men, though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Woman power, woman power. Okay.
Yeah. Huh?
Thank you guys so much for being in the meeting. Thank you so much, Adan, for putting this together. There's a link that Professor Cheesewright has put in. Please, guys, all the links that are being put in are for our benefits. Please take the time out of your days, if you can, to read them. Thank you so much to Dr. Kodero for taking your time out of your very, very busy day to come in and educate us on the racial financial wealth gap in the US. I want to thank everybody for coming through and giving us the opportunity to learn and, you know, have be like intellectually fed. That's what I think this is, an intellectual feeding. Thank you guys so much again for your time. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the evening. See y'all very soon, hopefully. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you guys.